Time to talk to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson, about this. He has been raising concerns about TikTok, in fact, for years. The platform itself is pushing back at the moves to force its sale. In fact, it's launched an all-out effort to defend itself, urging TikTok users to contact members of Congress and let them know they want the platform to stay. Here in Australia, as mentioned, the Prime Minister, well, he says millions of Australians engage on this platform.
You've got to think very carefully, in my view, before you start banning things as a first stop. We'll always take security advice, which is what we have done. The security advice isn't to ban TikTok. It is to make sure that, where appropriate, that there be some restrictions, and the government has put that on ourselves.
Senator James Paterson, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David.
So the Prime Minister there says the security advice is not to ban TikTok. Should that advice be followed?
Well, I have good news for the Prime Minister and Donald Trump, which is that the plan is not to ban TikTok. The plan is to make TikTok safe by removing the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And the threat of the ban is just the enforcement mechanism to make sure that TikTok complies with the law. The end that I hope for is that Australians can continue to use TikTok, but just without the risk that their data is abused and without the risk that the Chinese Communist Party can put its thumb on the algorithm to pump disinformation into our democracy.
But do you really think China's going to say, oh, OK, yeah, no, we'll sell it because America's told us to?
Well, it's a really interesting question for ByteDance. If they're acting like a rational commercial company, they should embrace this opportunity. Some independent assessments have said that TikTok is worth up to $160 billion US. And if the choice is accept a payday of $160 billion or stand by and allow your app to be banned and lose that value, then that would be a very irrational choice. But it would be quite an illustrative choice, because I suspect ByteDance would operate as it is, an extension of the Chinese government, not as a commercial entity, and that would be revealing.
Just in terms of the Australian context here, you heard what the Prime Minister said there about the advice they're getting, the security advice. He said Peter Dutton's been saying he believes the government has advice from intelligence agencies about TikTok and needs to respond to that in the appropriate way. Can you tell us what advice is Peter Dutton pointing to there?
Well, David, I've been extensively briefed by our intelligence community on the danger of TikTok, which it obviously wouldn't be appropriate for me to go into detail with, but let's just point to some things that are in the open source arena.
But should Peter Dutton be pointing to that?
Well, let me take you to that, David. Number one, TikTok was exposed for using their app to spy on journalists to identify their sources, and they lied about it. Number two, independent researchers have found on sensitive topics to the Chinese government, like Xinjiang, there is far more pro-Chinese government propaganda on the platform than any other comparable platform. And on issues sensitive and divisive in the West, like Israel and Gaza, there's far more pro-Hamas content than any other platform. And when this was pointed out, how did TikTok respond? They shut down the research tool that allowed these independent researchers to make those points and to identify that. So TikTok is a bad faith actor. It is a risk to our democracy. It's a risk to our national security. And the government should take action here to protect Australians from this very serious threat.
But are intelligence agencies here telling the government to do something that it's refusing to do?
Well, it was on the advice of intelligence agencies that the government banned TikTok from government devices. And I think that is very illustrative. It's not safe to be on the phone of a bureaucrat. Why should 8 million Australians have it on their devices without any protection at all?
Is the government ignoring advice from its agencies?
Well, it'd be very rare for intelligence agencies to recommend a policy solution. That's not really how they work. That's not their space. What they say is, these are the threats and these are the options to mitigate it. So the Prime Minister's being a bit cute when he says the intelligence agencies haven't recommended we ban it. Well, first of all, no one's recommending we ban it. We're just recommending you remove Chinese Communist Party influence.
But they are putting that as an option. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, you'd have to ask them. That's for them to talk about. That's not for me to talk about. But I'd be very surprised. In fact, I know for a fact the intelligence agencies are not saying to the Prime Minister, there's nothing to worry about with TikTok. There's no concerns at all. We know that's not the case.
So there's two main concerns that you're pointing to there. Just go to the first one, which is data harvesting, or your data being hoovered up. What do you think China is doing with that data?
Well, they can use it for espionage against individual people, and they can also use it at scale to build a very sophisticated picture of our society, and that's a very important asset for them to have in a digital age. You know, when ASIO assesses that foreign interference and espionage are our #1 security threat, and we know that much of that is cyber-enabled, having TikTok on the devices of almost half Australians, almost half of Americans, is a very serious national security threat.
TikTok says for Australian users, the data is held in Singapore, Malaysia, the United States, not in China.
Correct, and they've also acknowledged, including to me in a Senate hearing, that regardless of whether that data is stored, it can be accessed and is accessed by their engineers in China who work for ByteDance. And why that's important, David, is that those people are subject to the 2017 National Intelligence Law of China, and Article 7 of that law requires that all Chinese citizens and companies assist the work of Chinese intelligence agencies and keep that cooperation secret. So they could be handing over that data to the Chinese intelligence community without even ByteDance or TikTok knowing, and certainly without any Australians knowing.
And then your other concern is about the spread of misinformation. That can happen on any platform though, can't it? Do you need something wider than just targeting TikTok if that's the concern?
It absolutely does happen on all platforms, and this is quite an important point, David. Facebook regularly publicly assesses that there are attempted Chinese foreign interference attempts on their platform. They disclose that, they block it and they remove it. TikTok has never once found, in its own view, a Chinese foreign interference attempt on their platform. Now that's pretty curious, David. If the Chinese government is using Western headquartered social media platforms for disinformation, why would they not use the platform located in their own jurisdiction who they can directly control? And
the other big question a lot of people ask in this debate is, if you did get to a ban, how do you ban TikTok? You can't go around taking it off everyone's phone. So what would a ban actually involve?
We're looking at that right now, David. We're seeking advice on that, but actually there's lots of legislative options available here, and one of the precedents in our country is the Huawei decision. It is possible to ban high-risk vendors from our country. We do have extensive legislative options. I hope that the Minister for Home Affairs is looking at this right now. In fact, she has a bipartisan report from the Senate Select Committee on Foreign Interference through Social Media, which made 17 recommendations, one of which was, if the United States successfully removes TikTok from ByteDance, Australia should seek to do the same.
But
so really the clock is ticking.
Back to the, pardon the pun, back to the question on practically how you ban it. I mean, Huawei, that's hardware, you can ban the sale of physical phones, but with an app, you can't take it off people's phones. You might be able to stop them updating the latest version of the app down the track, but they can keep what they've got, can't they?
No, there's actually extensive legislative options here, David, in the Telecommunications Act, in the Critical Infrastructure Act. That is the least of my concerns. The biggest concern I have is the will to act here. I'm worried that the Albanese government is going to be weak on this, as they have been on so many other national security issues.
And what about WeChat? You've previously said this poses almost exactly the same espionage and data security risk that TikTok does. I mean, would you want that banned? Where do you draw the line? Is it whack-a-mole after a while with these things?
Well, David, I'm not advocating a ban to TikTok and I'm not advocating a ban to WeChat. What I'm advocating is removing the Chinese Communist Party control over all of these apps. And among the 17 recommendations, among the 17 recommendations that the Senate Select Committee on Foreign Interference through Social Media made was that we need to impose tough transparency obligations on these platforms. One of those is that they need to be transparent about the relationship they have with foreign governments and about the direction that they receive from foreign governments to interfere with content on the platform. They need to be transparent about what happens to the data and who can access it. Now, those recommendations are there for the government to implement at any time. They can pick those recommendations up. I really hope they do so.
Just before we leave TikTok, I've got to ask you this. If it is as dangerous and a national security risk as you mentioned, why does the Liberal Party have an official account on TikTok? I mean, we can see here some of your colleagues posting TikTok videos over the years. The latest post from the Liberal Party's account was on Friday, so they're pretty regular posts. Should the Liberal Party be on TikTok?
David, all Australian political parties and politicians are active on the platform. I think that's okay as long as they follow the government's national security advice about mitigating those risks. For example, it should not be on the same device that they have their work or personal information on. It should be on a standalone device.
Don't they need to set an example here, though? If it's a national security risk, why are they on it?
Well, David, that's actually not going to help Australians. There's 8.5 million Australians on this app. The only thing that can help Australians to protect them from that is not personal abstinence. It's actually the government taking action to protect them, and they can do that by passing laws. It's available to them right now, and they should do so.
So the party will keep using it until it's no longer allowed to?
Yeah, well, they don't need to ban it. They don't need to ban it for anyone, including the Liberal Party. It can be safe to use, but only once that relationship between ByteDance, the Chinese Communist Party, and the app is severed.
But you don't get on there?
No, I'm not personally a TikTok user.
Okay, I didn't think so. Let's move on. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is going to be in Canberra this coming week. Do you reckon this issue should be raised with him?
Actually, David, this is not a high priority issue to raise with the Chinese government. They are not going to fix this problem for us. Only we can fix it for themselves. And the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister have a long list of issues to raise with them, in particular and most importantly, the death sentence facing the Australian citizen Yang Henjun, the action that was taken against against Australian divers, Navy divers on HMAS Toowoomba, where they were harmed by Chinese sonar. Those are the high priority issues to be raised.
And I want to ask you about the immigration detention issue. The government, as we were talking about earlier, is trying to, it says, stay ahead of the curve here, further cases coming before the High Court, continuing to draw boundaries around who it can hold in immigration detention for how long. What do you think the government should be doing in preparation for some of these cases?
Well, Friday's briefing to the media was a desperate attempt to lower expectations further about the government's ability to respond to this, and with good reason. They've shown shocking incompetence every step of the way. The first thing they should do, David, is make an application to the court under the preventive detention regime that the Parliament passed 4 months ago to take just one of the 7 murderers, just one of the 37 sex offenders, just one of the other people convicted of violent crimes off the streets to protect the community. Because right now those people are out there in the community and they are reoffending against the community. 18 of them have breached state or federal law and face charges. 10 of them have breached their visa conditions, but unfortunately every one of those 10 is going to walk free because Andrew Giles completely stuffed up issuing their visas.
Well, you're talking there about taking a case to preventatively detain one of those who's already been released. It wants to be sure, the government says, that it's got a watertight case. That's why it's taking some time. If it failed at the first hurdle and the High Court ruled the preventative detention regime's no good, where would that leave them?
Sure, David, but it was only this week that the government announced that they put some extra lawyers on the case. Why didn't they do that 4 months ago?
Okay.
And if the government says that this bar is too high, that it's too difficult to apply, well, we've sat as a parliament for 2 weeks already. We're about to sit for another 2 weeks. Introduce amendments to lower the bar to make it easier to apply. I'm very confident that we would assist with swift passage so that these laws can actually be used. The government says their hands are tied.
Wouldn't lowering the bar to make it easier to lock people up create a greater risk? The High Court says that's no good, that's unconstitutional.
Well, David, we have a risk right now, which is that offenders, foreign offenders, are in the community re-offending against Australians. There are people who are now victims who should never have been victims because these people should not have been released into the community, and once they were, they should have been taken off the streets.
So back to the original question though, the further cases that are coming, the concern that could make it harder to hold even more people in immigration detention. After the event, no doubt the opposition would be critical of the government. So right now, what would you say the government needs to be doing?
2 things, David. Number one, they should not make concessions of fact like they did in the first case. Andrew Giles admitted that there was no reasonable prospect of NZYQ being deported, and the High Court said that was highly significant in their decision. I hope they don't make mistakes like that again. Secondly, they should be prepared. They should have the legislative options ready to go. They should have them ready to introduce into the Parliament the day after the court hands down its decision.
What should they have up their sleeve?
Well, last time we told them that they needed to have a preventative detention regime. Yeah. They spent 3 weeks saying that they couldn't do it until they finally admitted, actually, maybe we should, and then they did it.
So what do they need now?
Those are the kind of things. Well, David, it depends on the individual cases, right? But the Department of Home Affairs should be doing contingency planning here.
But this is the question. Is there anything you think the government should be doing right now to protect the community?
Well, it's a fair question, David, because we have led the government all this way and they've relied on our advice clearly to do this.
What's your advice now?
My advice last time was have a preventive detention regime. My advice this time is go to the Department of Home Affairs and ask them, what are the contingencies? If this happens, what should we do?
So just ask the department what their ideas are.
Well, it's clear that didn't happen last time, David.
But you don't have any new ideas?
David, I think I've provided enough for the government already. I've been pretty generous in that, and I hope they can find some of their own.
Australia's now joined Canada and Sweden in restoring funding to UNRWA, the UN relief agency in Gaza. The European Union's restored most of its funding. The Foreign Minister says the advice of Australia's various agencies is that taxpayer funds won't end up in the hands of terrorists. Do you disagree?
The Foreign Minister also said the advice was that UNRWA is not a terrorist organisation. David, that's not exactly a high bar. I think we should have higher expectations of our aid delivery partners than merely they are not terrorist organisations. What we do know is UNRWA has employed terrorists. UNRWA employees were involved in the attacks on Israel. on the 7th of October. An UNRWA social worker drove into Israel and abducted a dead
clear,
Israeli
that
back
was
into
the
Gaza.
allegation. An investigation is still underway.
No,
Staff
David,
have been dismissed.
That's not an allegation, that's evidence. The footage is available on the internet for anyone to see. UNRWA has sacked the people involved. There's no contention that there were UNRWA employees involved on the 7th of October. The question is what we now do about it. My view is that we should not tolerate a single Australian dollar going to a potential terrorist. I mean, this is not the only accusations against UNRWA. It's been exposed that there was a Hamas data centre underneath UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza that was drawing mains power from UNRWA. UNRWA has admitted in the past that their textbooks in UNRWA schools in Gaza have had anti-Semitic content that promotes hatred against the Jewish people. I mean, Israel has been warning us for years about the behaviour of UNRWA. Those warnings were ignored, and the consequences were UNRWA employees participating in the worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust.
But kids are starving in Gaza. You were just there. You made the point that aid is desperately needed, that it's a critical need for that food to get in to the kids in Gaza. Are you saying, though, that giving UNRWA money now is still going to see money end up in the hands of terrorists?
I have no confidence that UNRWA has reformed itself, particularly because our closest allies, like the United States and the United Kingdom, have not restarted their aid. And the obligation, David, is absolutely we must do everything we can to assist the people of Gaza, but without running the risk that our aid money goes to terrorist organisations.
So what's the solution here? How do you stop kids starving?
That means we have to explore every other alternative. That includes the airdrops that are happening. That includes the delivery by sea. The first delivery by sea happened overnight, David, by a United Arab Emirates delivery, working with another charity, World Central Kitchen. I mean, we had been hearing in the lead up to this that there's no one other than UNRWA capable of delivering aid. That is clearly not true. The United States is also exploring alternative options like sea delivery. There are other charity partners operating in the region. We should do everything we can in the safest way we can to make sure that the listed terrorist organisation of Hamas doesn't end up with Australian taxpayer funds.
A final question related to this. The government has revoked visas of some of those. It issued visas to trying to flee Gaza. Penny Wong has said that they're all subject to ongoing security checks. What does this tell you? You were worried about adequate security checks. Do you accept they are happening?
Well, maybe they're now happening, David, but several months ago we raised these questions and the government attacked us and said we were smearing them and politicising national security. It turns out we were right to ask these questions. They were granting visas to people that their own security advice now says they shouldn't, and no wonder, because they were rushing them through so quickly. I mean, some of these visas were approved in 24 hours. The ABC has reported there was a visa granted in a single hour. It is just not possible to do adequate identity, let alone security checks, on people coming from a war zone run by a terrorist organisation in that short amount of time, and it's hardly surprising that we've now had to cancel visas that were issued while these people were in the air. But frankly, the government should apologise, because they assured us all the necessary checks were done, they were thorough, and there was nothing to be concerned about. Well, clearly that was not true.
Senator James Paterson, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.